It's a pleasure to be here. I realized that I just remember when I came into this room, I gave a talk in this room, but probably before some of you were born. I don't know, many years ago. Many years ago. So thanks, Matthias and Errol, for inviting me. And I have to start with a disclaimer, which is that I came to today's topic through the side door. So by serendipity, Miriam Sperring, a former postdoc in my lab, and I stumbled into a finding that was really interesting, and then it motivated other research. But literally, we were not looking for it. And it's fortunate in a way because a lot of the methodological issues that have been criticized, and rightly so, about a lot of the work in consciousness simply don't apply here. And I'll tell you why, okay? So that's the first thing that I have to confess, that I came through the side. The second is I tend to walk, but I shouldn't because of, okay. The second is that I try to avoid the word consciousness. Apparently, I've only printed it once, and I'm much more comfortable talking about awareness because consciousness is such a loaded term. But like 5 people in the Future of Consciousness workshop at NIH, to which I was invited, and again I said, I don't do consciousness, but they said, your findings are really interesting for this. So they told me I should put consciousness. In any case, today I want to talk about perception-action dissociations, a window into conscious and unconscious processes. And the second, as Errol mentioned, actually, my research is mainly on visual perception and attention. And we have studied all kinds of attention in the lab, spatial, feature-based, temporal attention, pre-saccadic attention. Needless to say, obviously, always defining, operationalizing, manipulating. Very careful about how we use that word. And we've studied its effects on many visual aspects. For example, of spatial vision mainly, but for example, contrast sensitivity, spatial resolution, acuity, texture segmentation. We have a lot of studies on how attention facilitates perceptual learning and helps generalize. And another line of research in the lab has to do with the visual field heterogeneity, in particular with eccentricity and polar angle effects. And for all those things, we use psychophysics, neuroimaging, neurosimulation, computational modeling. Now, today, where I'm going to talk about this dissociation, it's important that we start with a definition of perception, the representation of information from a stimulus, without assuming that it's necessarily experienced consciously. And some people have claimed for the philosophical debate of consciousness that it's important to consider that this is an individual level phenomenon, not merely an occurrence in the visual system or brain. And I'll come back to this. Now, much research in consciousness is driven by the question, can people perceive visual events in the absence of any acknowledged awareness? And a number of experimental protocols that probe perception without awareness have been developed to maintain constant sensory input while allowing awareness to fluctuate, for example, through attentional blink, backward masking, binocular rivalry, and continuous flash suppression. Now, in this, the ability to detect or discriminate a stimulus is often equated with awareness, and many have pointed, and rightly so, for example, Megan Peters and Haquan Lo, that there's a lot of problems in many of the tasks that include a criterion bias and many other issues. So, for example, a report of unseen does not necessarily imply complete awareness of the stimulus. Rather, such reports may merely indicate that the stimulus was below a certain threshold, making it hard to see and thus not to be reported. And as I said, I'm going to tell you a procedure that actually overcomes these problems as well as other methodological issues. But before I do that, let's just go quickly into the eye movements world. And let's remember that eye movements reflect cognition. So eye movements are used in many contexts to study development, categorization, emotion, neuropsychology, and they are based on the assumption that they reflect, or the study of eye movements in all these areas are based on the assumption that they reflect what we see, perceive, think, desire. This well-known study by Yarbus over 50 years ago, showed that eye movements vary according to the questions that people are asked. So showing this painting, The Unexpected Return, when people are asked what activities have been performed before the entry of the unexpected visitors, you can see that this is the pattern of eye movements. But if instead people are asked to estimate how long was the unexpected visitor gone, eye movements were quite different. Not surprisingly, they really go to all the faces because people are trying to read the facial expression, right? Now, the view that eye movements reflect perceptual awareness has been long held. There's links between perception and eye movements, and a number of eye movements have been studied. For example, saccade, voluntary pursuit, when you follow a fly carefully, and reflexive ocular following response. And the utility of eye movements as sensitive indicators of cognitive processes relies on the key assumption that we look at objects that we're actively processing. And there's many reviews that have this view, and it is true. In many cases, eye movements reflect our perception. However, eye movements can reflect visual processing without awareness. And as I said with Miriam Sperring, we did some work in this area that started with a serendipity area, and then we had a teens review in which we concentrated on reviewing later on the findings, the studies that had supported this view of a dissociation between eye movements and aware perception. And the way that we organized the review was in 3 sections. The first one, we concentrated on uncorrelated responses in perception and eye movements in a trial-by-trial basis. So there's a number of experiments that show that on average, the perception and the eye movements match. But when you look carefully in a trial-by-trial basis, there's an absolute dissociation. Now, we also concentrated on quantitative differences and qualitative dissociations. So let's start with the uncorrelated responses. So when people are presented a random motion and then they have to do a discrimination task, these moves are simply moving in a certain direction, and then there's an arrow that they have to adjust. It's well known that there's a horizontal repulsion. And the interesting thing in this study is that they found the horizontal repulsion, that is, the dots seem to be moving away from the reference. The horizontal repulsion was there in perception, as it's often the case, but also they found it in the ocular following response, which is a reflexive, smooth tracking movement in response to a sudden onset of a large field, rapid stimulus motion. But interestingly, when you look at the right and you analyze the data for each observer, you see that there's no correlation whatsoever between the response bias in perception and the ocular following response. That's a kind of studies in which the general average agrees, but there's no correlation. Then there's another set of studies in which people have reported quantitative differences, that is, magnitude differences between the eye movement and the perception. And I'll use this study from Tavasoli and Rinkas to illustrate this. So when you have a stimulus whose speed either increases first and then decreases, or first decreases and then increases, and observers are asked to discriminate the speed changes with 5 different perturbation magnitudes, you can see on the right, when you plot percent correct against perturbation magnitude, that these are the schematic results from one observer. You can see that pursuit eye movements, which are in blue, are reliably discriminate speed changes even when perception was a chance. So this is a quantitative difference. The eye knew earlier than your aware or than aware perception. And the third kind of studies, which I find the most interesting, little bias, are the qualitative dissociations. And those are the ones that I'm going to concentrate on today, because for me, those are the ones that make the point that we want to make in the strongest possible way. And in particular, I'm going to tell you about 4 studies, 2 with Miriam Sparing, then 1 student with Petra Vetter and Steph Bade, who is there. She's your colleague at Tufts University. And then I'm going to end up with some points that we made in a perspective piece last year, in which we tried to bring this information together and what the implications are for the field. So, since I don't know the background of people here, I'm going to go very basic at the beginning just to make sure that we're on the same page. So, as we know, our eyes see overlapping information and different information, and this is useful for depth perception. To study binocular rivalry, different information is presented to the 2 eyes, as you can see here. And the interesting thing is that when you project that through a 4-mirror stereoscope here, which is simply a way to project a different image onto a different eye without people's knowledge of it, you can study how the eye that dominates fluctuates on time, and that's a typical binocular rivalry, and we've done a lot of work on that. But today I want to talk about a binocular rivalry flash suppression with monocular adaptation, and I'll explain it now. The important thing here is that that procedure allows us to render the non-adapted motion direction dominant, whereas the adapted motion is going to be temporarily suppressed from perception. So this is the way it works. Oh, and by the way, so this is Miriam, and we are obviously doing eye tracking of your eyes. And this was, again, the purpose of the study was very different at the beginning, and I'll tell you about it. But let's start with this. So what your left eye is going to be seeing is this downward motion, whereas your right eye sees this rightward motion. And those component motion elements are processed in V1. But what you perceive is pattern motion, and that is mainly carried out in MT. Now, for the binocular rivalry flash suppression, you will be looking at these 2 images, one on each eye, and you're going to first see one stimulus on one eye, and we're going to refer to this as the adapted stimulus because you see it for a while. After a brief interval, we're going to see 2 concurrently. The one on the left is adapted, and the one on the right, which is the novel one, we're going to call unadapted. And that is known to dominate. And many people have shown this. And then we're going to ask people to adjust the arrows to indicate the perceived motion direction. So if suppression is effective, this is what you would see. Even though both of them are there, you would see only the second. Of course, that was a cartoon, and then you are asked to adjust, okay? In our protocol, so observers, again, viewed first one stimulus for 1,500 milliseconds. This adaptation, this adapted study is going to be motion to the right, shown to the left eye. After a brief interval, both of them are going to be presented concurrently. This one keeps moving to the left, and the unadapted one moves downwards in this particular example. And of course, we're going to cross all the possible orientations. And at the end of the trial, observers reported the motion direction of the stimulus during the test phase. So you just say, what did you see last? And you're aware that you see a sequence of 2, okay? Now, not only we had this estimation task that people could, this bar that people could analogously adjust, but we also had another protocol that gave us exactly the same information, which is we have these 8 arms here, and people, and it's a graded scale from 1 to 10, and people can indicate if they saw 2 motions at the same time, which one was dominant by going farther in the scale. So in this case, you would say mainly I saw down, but there was a little bit of right, okay? So the idea is that we have 2 ways. One is analog, complete adjustment, and the other is to give you the opportunity to tell us that there were 2 or maybe even 3 motions, okay? And those of you that have done the traditional binocular rivalry experiments know that actually information fluctuates. There's like these waves, and at some point you see that you see both, and then the other dominates, and so forth. But in this case, it's very fast. And actually, Jeremy Wolf introduced this method, had nothing to do with eye movements, but I think it was in this department when it was introduced. So as a grad student, I think, right after undergraduate at Princeton. So again, observers are going to respond with the estimation or with this 10 interval scale. And just to remind you again, we're going to call the component 1, the one that was on the left eye, the adapted stimulus, the component 2, the one on the right eye, the unadapted stimulus. And if both of them were presented simultaneously without having presented one of them, you would see the pattern motion that I showed you before, okay? So what we found in the experimental condition is that if this is the direction of the same stimulus and this is of the orthogonal, virtually all the perceptual responses, 95, correspond to the second stimulus, the orthogonal one, the non-adapted one. So this is just replicating what other people have found with this procedure. And we did a control in which we just show one of the directions, and of course people respond 100%, so that's just to make sure that people are doing the task well. The interesting thing is what happened to the eye movement. And what happened to the eye movement, to these pursuit eye movements, is that, as you can see in blue, they actually concurrently follow the pattern motion. And in control conditions in which both of them were going down or both of them were going right, people did the eye move where it should move. So literally, I'll never forget, Miriam came into my office and she said, oh shit, people are, sorry, or Chaisa, probably. People are moving their eyes. What's wrong with these people? And maybe some of these people are in this room. Sam, were you a subject? No. Okay, Stuart was one, I remember. That sample is Stuart. And so I said, wait, let's look at it. And I look at it, and I said, but they're not moving it randomly. What is this? Like, literally, we were shocked. And she's like, I wrote my German Foundation, grant, and I have to do what I said. I said, Miriam, this may be more interesting, and let's just pursue this. Let's see how reliable it is, okay? And I'll tell you. In the first one, nothing. The one that I just showed you data, nothing. You're just looking, it's simply to present, well, you are fixated at the beginning in each of them, right? And this is very quickly, you're told nothing. But this is a good point but I'll get there just in a second. Let me just tell you before that these are all the data for the pattern motion, and the cardinal control conditions that are the right are very clear when you see both of them. So people can move their eyes left and right. So because we found this strong dissociation that we were not looking for, we said, okay, let's give some instructions to the eye now. So the first one was completely uninstructed. So one of them we said, track the movement of what you see, and it was like 99% in that direction. And in another one, we said, fixate, do not move your eyes. And in 85% of the trials, the eyes still moved in that direction. And then we changed the stimulus size, and we changed the contrast, and we did like 4 other controls. All of them are in the appendix of the first paper, and the results were exactly the same. So once we knew, yes? We electrocuted them. No, they did not get punishment, no. But we really instructed them, and this is funny because this is in a lab of covert attention where a lot of the people know, like, they are really trained to not move their eyes, and even in other studies, people come to me and say, what's with your people? They don't move the eyes. So the eyes were moving, okay? No, so they felt shame. They felt shame if they moved their eyes. No, so we were, and we do a lot of eye movements too, by the way, but no, we did not go to the extreme of punish them, but we say really fixate because you're going to perceive the motion better. It's not true, but it didn't make a difference. So once we had established that this phenomenon was reliable and generalizable, and by the way, present in every single observer, then we decided to investigate what we originally wanted to investigate, okay? And our general question, now we then ask, can we modulate the representation strength of each direction? That was the original question without the aware and unaware. Our original question is, can we modulate the representation strength of each direction? Okay. Now, the aware and unaware come here because now I've shown you that we do that if we're aware or if we're unaware. And to do that, we use feature-based attention. And just again, a very, very simple reminder that feature-based attention allows us to selectively process visual information for particular features in a given dimension. So for example, you could process red in the color dimension like this. So imagine that I'm going to a concert and I'm looking for Samling who wore this red jacket every day during grad school for 5 years. I would look for red, right? That's in principle what you would do. There's a lot of work from Mansell and Stefan Troy's lab and so forth, Martinez Trujillo. We know that feature-based attention is very powerful and we know that it's global. So even if you attend at a particular location, throughout the space, you are selectively processing that particular feature that you're attending to, whether it's relevant or irrelevant, okay? Now, we know feature-based attention exists in monkeys and in humans, and there's a lot of psychophysics and neuroimaging studies in addition to electrophysiology. So we wanted to see whether we could manipulate the strength of the representation of each eye through through feature-based attention. And now remember, I added the aware and unaware because now we know that some of it people are going to be aware and some of it people are going to be unaware of. So we used a very similar protocol. You see here, this is the protocol that I had shown you before. But now, before the two stimuli are presented, we instruct observers to attend to one motion, say diagonal to the right, the other motion, diagonal to the left, or both of them with these arrows. And that would be the neutral condition. That would be equivalent to not selectively attending. So in some trials, there's going to be a speed change that you can see here, this increment. And we ask participants to indicate the motion direction and whether it's speed change. Okay? So first, sanity checks. So attention improves the speed change detection of both the reported component, which is the orthogonal stimulus, and the unreported component, which is the same stimulus, the one that had been adapted to. That's a main effect of attention. Then, of course, sanity check is, did the system adapt? Do we have the typical effect of adaptation? Yes, we do, because the sensitivity is stronger for the non-adapted than for the adapted stimulus, okay? Those are simply our always present behavioral sanity checks. Now, what happened with I'm going to show you what happened with perception and what happened with the eye movements. So we tested diagonal directions, and the perception followed the motion of the orthogonal stimulus because it's the one, you can see here, yeah, it's the one that is not adapted, that is expected. But the pursuit reflected pattern motion. That is, the vector averaging, in this case, is straight up. Okay? And this happened in all directions. So the perception is always in the orthogonal direction, that is, in the non-adapted stimulus. Okay? And at the same time, the pursuit is always in the average direction. So you can see that there's a very similar direction on the top panel, regardless of whether the orthogonal direction was to the left or to the right. And there's a very similar pattern in the bottom panel, regardless of whether the orthogonal direction was to the left or to the right. Is that clear? So again, there's a vector average of the eye. Now what happens to the attended stimulus? And people can attend the orthogonal stimulus, the one that was the new one, or the same stimulus, the one that had already been presented. right? So in the attention conditions, both perception and pursuit of the adapted and the non-adapted components were shifted towards the cued motion direction. So attention enhanced the responses to the orthogonal stimulus, but more interestingly and novel is that the eye movements were towards the orthogonal stimulus. So in this case, perception and pursuit match. And when the observer attended to the same stimulus, that is the one that he had been adapted, now you see this difference in the response. Instead of the orthogonal just dominated, you can see this gray area. Now the responses are equal in the orthogonal direction and in the new direction. Okay? And furthermore, now pursuit goes in the same direction. So the eye movements towards the same, the adapted, the suppressed perception only happen when attended. So perception and pursuit match in the direction of the attended stimulus, whether it was the orthogonal or adapted stimulus or the same non-adapted stimulus. Okay? Perception rules. Now, yes?
Try to dissociate vector average and perception experience. Like, in other words, like, I mean, you could potentially explain the eye movement result as sort of like averaging these two motion signals, but it could also be representative of like the integration of it.
Yes, and if you don't mind, we can talk about that a little bit because actually we know that there's cells in MT that are more for integration. But regardless, the pattern is that it's going down, right? Whether it is an integration, and it is clearly not that I'm alternating, because if sometimes I went left and sometimes I went right, that would be just my average, but that's not what I'm showing you. What I'm showing you is literally the direction of the pattern motion, right?
Yeah, I guess what I'm...
Let's wait to keep the assertions for the end until like it's clarificatory.
So what I've told you so far is that feature-based attention affects both aware perception and eye movements. Attention improves speed detection, replication, many people have shown that. The interesting thing again here is that the same adapted stimulus, which is suppressed in the neutral condition, becomes available to aware perception. And we know that feature-based attention exerts its influence both at cortical and subcortical levels, affects perceived direction and pursuit responses similarly, even though only the first one, the perception, reflects awareness. And, okay, is there any clarification question so far? Yeah.
Are there any differences between the eye in terms of the movements, howsoever subtle?
No, and actually what we do, so we usually, we present. In this one, we always presented the same on the left. In the next study that I'm going to tell you about, we always presented what we wanted to dominate on the dominant eye. But no, we did not find differences in the eyes. Thanks. So feature-based attention modulated the balance of the unaware and aware directions on actual guidance on the movement. And pursuit no longer reflected the average motion direction, but reflected the attended direction, okay? So it strengthened the representation of the attended motion direction while weakening the representation of the unattended direction. And we can say that because we always have the neutral conditions, so we can see that they were both benefits and costs, okay? Now, I want to go back to this schema and just add something. So before I told you that eye movements can be the window into cognition or a window into cognition and perception. And now we know that this is the case even when the stimulus evoked brain activity fails to reach awareness. And how can this be? Well, first of all, eye movements can reflect processing without awareness, as indicated by these qualitative dissociations, and yet have the similar effects of voluntary attention, which is a bit surprising, right? Because now it's like voluntary attention is having access really deep, let's put it that way. Now, we know that there's optimal responses that depend on task demands. So, for example, for perception, we often discriminate or categorize visual information, and it's good to be more selective than integrative. In contrast, for eye movements, fast-orienting responses to information can reflect that even if observers are unaware of, may reflect that it's important to integrate information across time and space and spatial frequencies. So the demands for perception and eye movements may be different, and that's something to keep in mind. And the ability to act on unperceived visual information while simultaneously evaluating perceived components may facilitate successful interaction with a complex and dynamic visual environment. Now, how could that happen? Well, there could be different mechanisms, but they also can be brain parallel pathways. So I'm going to do the most simplified schematic representation that one could imagine, just to remind you, and so we only have feed-forward connections, and not all the areas implicated in oculomotor control are going to be shown. So it's super, super, super simplified and schematic. This was for a review, and I'm showing you the cartoon, but just to make the point, which many other people have made, that it is the retinogeniculate pathway, which is indicated here on red, which goes from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus, then to V1, and then from V1 projects to dorsal and ventral areas. The one that we think that is responsible for perception most of the time. Now, it's more interesting for this particular, and by the way, from V1 is going to go to areas that are important in eye movements too, like LIP and FEF. And sorry, that was the microphone. I shouldn't move my hands. And this is also known like the Parvo pathway, which specializes in high spatial frequency and primarily conscious or aware perception. Now, there's a subcortical route that could provide a shortcut to drive motor actions, such as fast orienting eye movements to targets of interest before visual information reaches awareness. And a possible candidate is illustrated here in blue, which is the retinotectal pathway. So we know that this pathway connects the retina to the brainstem, oculomotor areas through the superior colliculus, and then through the pulvinar, through the pulvinar, it links to higher cortical areas. In particular, through the pulvinar nucleus of the thalamus, there's going to be information that then is projected to MT and to cortical areas that are involved in eye movements, such as LIP and frontal eye field. Okay? And we know that this retinotectal pathway plays a role in reflexive and short latency eye movements. It's also known more as a magno pathway. It specializes in low spatial frequencies. And interesting, this pathway is associated with the processing of information that drives residual visual abilities in patients with blind sight. So as you know, people that have had a stroke, for example, and often get damage in V1. And now, thanks to Crystal Hoxlin and her group, we know that it's not only V1, but also V2 and probably V3, but mainly V1, V2. They can nonetheless perceive, respond to, and even recognize visual objects. And this subcortical pathway bypasses V1, but it goes to MT. And in particular, we know that people with cortical blindness respond well to motion stimuli. Okay? Now, the next question is, can emotion influence eye movements in the absence of visual awareness? And Petra Vetter, who's now a professor in Freiburg, came to my lab to do a postdoc to ask this question. We wrote together this idea. And then Steph Barre, who was a postdoc in Mike Landy's lab, but she's, how do we say, an adopted Carrasco lab member too, an honorary member, contributed a lot too. So we ended up having this interesting collaboration. And this happened after the review that I told you about. So we already knew the existence of this dissociation. And here we investigated whether suppressed emotional information can guide actions, or if such information needs to enter awareness to do so. Okay? So we use continuous flash suppression and assess the success of suppression through both objective and subjective measures. In the non-dominant eye, we presented an image, and in the dominant eye, a fast flickering one. So in this case, I'm sorry, the person that is in the back, in this case, we actually went to the dominant eye, and that's where we put the fast flickering. And in the non-dominant eye, we had one phase. Okay? And that phase, because we wanted to study the emotional content of faces, we had faces that were neutral, angry, or fearful. So the logic was that if threat-related emotional information guides eye movements, the eye trajectories would differ from those when neutral faces are presented. And moreover, the trajectories could depend on the nature of the threat. So an angry face poses a direct threat because it's to you, like I look at Earl in an angry way. Or I may have a fearful face, and that's an indirect threat. That tells you that something bad is in the environment, but it's not directly to you. It's indirect. We don't know exactly what it is. So we thought, to be honest, when we started, I thought that that distinction was a little bit far-fetched and that very unlikely we would get any differential response, but I thought that we would get a differential response between the natural faces and the emotional faces. Now, you can see here on the bottom that we have the faces upside down, and we always do that because that way you keep the constant stimuli, all the features are constant, but people cannot read the content, the emotional content of upside down faces. And that's important to do, and we've done that in other studies, some with sampling, on how perception affects emotion, modulates perception, attention, and so forth, because, for example, if you're angry or if you're scared or so, there's some high frequencies that are present if you open your mouth or if you have more wrinkles and so forth. So we simply put exactly the same stimuli so that we can then know whether any differential response is really attributed to the emotional content or to the differences in featural stimulation, okay? And what we're going to, and of course, we're going to be eye tracking all the time, and here our main focus was on what was going to happen to the eyes. So in the experimental protocol, we had a mandatory fixation. Once people had fixated for 200 milliseconds, then we had the continuous flicker, and then we would get a fading in of the face stimulus for 1 second, and then it goes away, and the mask dominates. Okay, this has been used by many people. The thing that we did here, because we wanted to make sure that people were really unaware of that face, is we asked, so first of all, the instruction while the mask is on is simply look out for a face hidden behind the mask. So we're telling you there is a face, and we want you to move your eyes. So here goes to the instruction, because to find the face, presumably you're moving the eyes, right? Now, once the mask is off, we ask 3 questions. Where was the picture? Was it in quadrant 1, 2, 3, or 4? So a 4 alternative choice. They have to tell us in which they were. Second, we asked which emotional expression was the face, angry, fearful, or neutral, and before we run the experiment, we showed them the faces so that it was clear to them which faces they were seeing and so forth. And last, we asked how visible were they? Not at all, brief glimpse, almost clear, or very clear. And we asked this question because in the consciousness literature, this is an often question to be asked, which makes sense because it tells you something about the subjective report, but for us it was particularly important to have the two objective responses too, because we want to make sure that this is not a criterion change, okay? So, here again are the phases, and in a conservative approach, and according to the view that consciousness is a continuous rather than all or none process, we analyzed only the data from the participants whose objective performance across trials was a chance for both questions, for the phase identity and for the phase location. And when they matched their subjective impression of zero visibility. Okay, so we were very, very strict with the data that we analyzed. And I hope that is clear for you why it's important to have both objective and subjective methods concurrently. Now, what did we find? In the absence of awareness, the eyes look away from angry faces, but towards fearful faces. So, what we did is the following. For analysis purposes, even though the faces appeared in all quadrants, for analysis purposes, we rotated them so that all are now on the upper right quadrant, okay? And what you can see that for the angry faces, the dwell time is significantly higher away from the face, whereas for fearful faces, the dwell time is significantly higher towards the face. Now, we look at the time course and we plot the gaze distance from the target. And what you see in the top panel is that gaze is closer for fearful in blue than neutral in gray and angry faces in red. But for the upside down faces, those differences are completely eliminated. And that means, obviously, that it's not the low visual features that are responsible for this effect, but rather we're disrupting the emotional processing. So our results provide the first evidence that eye movements can reflect qualitative processing of emotional expressions, and that threat-related emotional stimuli can guide eye movements even in the absence of visual awareness. So eye movements were modulated by the type of threat conveyed through the emotional expressions. So directing our eyes towards ambiguous, fearful faces may be an automatic response to try to gather more information. Of course, this is speculation points. Whereas directing our eyes away from angry faces, which pose a direct threat, may be an automatic avoidant response. The interpretation, of course, is speculative as always, but the findings are very clear. There were differences between the angry and the fearful face. Now, if we go back to our very, very simplified schematic representation, let me remind you, we have the main pathway that is related to perception, the retinogeniculate pathway in red. Then in blue, we have the retinotactile pathway that I already talked about, which is a possible candidate for the more sensitive processes of unconscious information or unaware information that influence the eye via the subcortical pathway. And we know that this retinotactile pathway has also been associated with the swift processing of emotional information via a pulvinar amygdala V1 route in green. So in addition to cortical structures, we know that emotionally evocative stimuli that individuals are unaware of activate subcortical areas, including the amygdala, the pulvinar, the basal ganglia, and the superior colliculus. So whereas the amygdala is going to assess emotional expressions and is best characterized as, or it has, most of the work has really been done with fearful, negative expressions and fearful expressions, we know that the basal ganglia and the superior colliculus guide eye movements, and they could do so according to a fight, flight, or freeze response. So to summarize, I've told you that eye movements reflect visual processing in the absence of visual awareness. I show you examples of these three groups, the variability, where there's uncorrelated trial-to-trial responses, quantitative differences, that difference only in magnitude, and qualitative dissociations, a difference in the direction of the response. As a matter of fact, when we put together all the perception and pursuit answers that we have, which were thousands, we found that in perception, 98.2% of the trials went to the orthogonal, to the non-adapted stimulus. 1.5 to the same, and average 0.3. In contrast, for pursuit, we found that 99% went to the average and less than 1% to the orthogonal, and the same. So this is a strong dissociation as I've seen. Now, then we know not only that eye movements reflect visual processing in the absence of visual awareness, but this qualitative dissociation of aware perception and eye movements, somehow feature-based attention has access to it, right? So the effects of feature-based attention were exactly the same on the unaware and the aware directions. And we think that further investigating whether and how spatial and feature-based attention affect perceptual reports assessed by different tasks and different eye movements would help probe situations in which visual processing could potentially lead to awareness. And last, I've told you that eye movements reflect emotional content in the absence of visual awareness. Now, when I participated in NIH in this workshop of advances of consciousness a couple years ago, there were many presentations on the no report. And the no report is that a lot of people are saying now, oops, let's not ask people anything to do anything. Let's just see what happens with their oculomotor and the pupillary responses. And this has been getting more prevalent in consciousness research. So that means, obviously, that the no-report protocols equate eye movements and conscious perception. So for instance, some authors interpret a distinct pattern of eye movements in response to face stimuli as indicating that people are aware of their surroundings, and that tracking changes in the pattern of eye movements when the faces are dimmer allows researchers to discern whether people perceive the face or not without asking them. And we have these dissociations, right? That is the finding that people can show the same pattern of eye movements with or without visual awareness questions this interpretation. Because the way that I think about it is that the associations I've been telling you about provide a cautionary tale about inferring conscious perception. So it is true that these qualitative dissociations cannot solve the methodological challenges of uncovering the neural basis of consciousness, but they do offer a clear cautionary tale regarding the no-report paradigms. Other people have criticized these paradigms. For example, my colleague and friend, Ned Block, criticized these paradigms, and he actually called for a no-cognition protocol in which observers' perceptual states are not accompanied by corresponding deliberation and reasoning about the stimulus. This is problematic because in the absence of a task, observers are known to spontaneously engage in mind-wandering. And hence, those protocols could not, if they don't include a report, they may in fact assess the neural correlates of mental disengagement and engagement rather than of consciousness. Now, I want to point out that in the studies that I just told you about, there's no mind wandering for the following reasons. One of them is that the stimulus presented were very, very brief. So there's no time for mind wandering. Usually the studies of mind wandering are in the seconds, many, many seconds realm. Second, people performed a perceptual task. They were engaged on it, and they performed well. When we had an objective measure, they performed rather well. For example, in the feature-based attention, and we saw the modulations that are expected to be seen with adaptation and with attention. And third, eye wandering is known to have very disorganized eye movement patterns, but we found very systematic pattern of eye movements. And eye movements are widely used as indicators of perceptual and cognitive processes across many applications, as I said at the beginning. But the one that I was thinking about in particular is, they're included in research in child psychology, in human factors, in clinical studies. And our view is that whereas eye movements can reflect that the system is responding to visual information, they do not imply a direct indicator. They are not a direct indicator, and they don't imply the presence of consciousness. That's the cautionary tale. We think that examining normal and abnormal eye movements is very informative. So, for example, examining eye movements and pupillary responses in some cases has been critical for diagnosis and treatment of patients with severe brain damage and neurological disorders. And we know, for instance, that fixation and visual pursuit can actually contribute to the diagnosis of patients with minimal consciousness state. Our findings have no direct implications for a diagnostic use of explicit, instructed, overt eye movements or reactive pupillary responses in this context. I think they're very useful. However, we caution the interpretation of what eye movements may indicate in terms of conscious capacities in patients with disorders of consciousness. So, to conclude, I have shown you experimental protocols to investigate perception, attention, and emotion with concurrent tracking of eye movements, which circumvent the criterion issues and other methodological challenges that have been pointed out by several, and which I agree with. And those methodological challenges had limited a lot of the conclusions of other studies. Now, the strong qualitative dissociations between perception and eye movements, which reflect information processing in the absence of visual awareness, I think are useful and could provide methodological paths for further investigations. And lastly, I have shown you why I think we have a very strong cautionary note about equating eye movements with conscious perception. And to end, of course, I just want to acknowledge the current as well as previous lab members in the lab. I'm fortunate enough to have some here, actually. And I've been incredibly lucky with having wonderful people in the lab. And today, the work that I showed you highlighted the work by Miriam Sperring, Petra Vetter, and Stephanie Bade in the lab at NYU. And no, I don't only have German women postdocs. I happen to have many, many different postdocs. But I would be more than happy to take any question, and thank you for your attention.